Hello and welcome back to my channel and the first part of a new retrospective on the French director Claude Chabrol, who was one of the most notable figures in the French Nouvelle Vague, the New Wave. Now, Claude Chabrol, right, he's a director who is doomed forever to be a man between two commas. What do I mean by that? Whenever I was studying film in the past and reading about the Nouvelle Vague, it always went Truffaut, comma, Godard, comma, Chabrol, comma, Rivette, comma, Roma, full stop. They were the right bank filmmakers. Then you got Alan Resnais and Agnes Varda on the left bank. Chabrol was always third. He was always the man in the middle. And that's what he's been in film history ever since. He's the forgotten man of the Nouvelle Vague. And part of the reason for that is because the other directors, after the initial phase of the Nouvelle Vague, they sort of went off, they fractaled off in their own direction, did their own thing, and became very distinctive and unusual filmmakers. Chabrol kind of stuck to the same game. And he's kind of the purist of the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers. These young guys, when they were critics, were highly influenced by classic Hollywood cinema. And what they really got into was this idea of the auteur. So you got mainstream movies in mainstream genres, but certain directors, you could tell their personality, they had a distinctive texture or style or theme. And they really got into that, so whether it was Hitchcock or Hawks or John Ford. And in a way, Chabrol in his own career stayed true to that. He's thought of as an art house director, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But really what he did was he stayed within a particular genre, the murder genre. I think it was said once about Chabrol, as long as he's got a nice dinner and a nice murder at the end, then he's happy. That's his movie. And it's true, all his movies have got a murder in, and they're all kind of murder thrillers, really, right? And he stayed in that. He didn't move outwards like Rivette or Godard or Roma and try different things. He just kept going, in that vein. So, in a sense, he followed the American auteurs that he admired so much. He stayed pure to that original Nouvelle Vague idea. And in a way, that tripped him up in film history because he wasn't taken as seriously as Godard or Rivette. I want to show in this retrospective that he's a director who is worth taking seriously. The other problem for Chabrol was he was a critic along with Roma and Godard, and he wrote about Hitchcock. And throughout his career, because he concentrated on murder and various levels of evil, he was always compared to Hitchcock and Lang. He was always seen as a sort of disciple. He was never allowed to have his own personality as a director. And one of the things I want to do in this retrospective to show that he is his own director. And he's got a very distinctive style, aesthetic, and theme. Interestingly, when Chabrol was asked about, the influence and legacy of Hitchcock and Lang, he said, actually, I'm much more influenced by Friedrich Murnau and Ernst Lubitsch. Worth bearing that in mind as we look through this retrospective, especially when we look at this film, which has got long extended party sequences in it, with the sort of frothiness that we associate with Lubitsch. Now, what have we got here? We've got a very simple film. I'm starting this retrospective with the second film that Chabrol made. His first film, Le Beau Serge, is often considered to be the first true feature film of the Nouvelle Vague. That's a bit dubious. There's all sorts of claims for other films. But okay, it's often considered. Now, I like Le Beau Serge, but I'm not that interested in it because it's quite a chunky film. And it still has traces of the sort of cinéma de qualité which they were trying to fight against. So I'm going to start with this second film, which has been one of my favourite Chabrol films, if not my favourite, for a long time. And I have to confess that the reason I like this film so much is because it's a very special film for me personally, in terms of what it's about. It's a simple story of a country bumpkin, a lad from the provinces, coming to the big city. He's a young student and he's going to stay with his cousin, who's more worldly wise and sophisticated, a bit of a city boy. And it's a fish out of water story. Two boys who are contrasting personalities. It's basic stuff. Why do I like it so much? I like it because what Chabrol often does in his films, he pitches two different personalities, sort of twisted mirror images of each other against each other, one of whom should be, according to normal ideas, good, and one of whom should be, according to normal morality, bad. But then he shows how that dichotomy, that simple dichotomy, is not so straightforward, that there might be some bad elements in the good, good elements in the bad. And this film itself is a mirror image of the previous film, Le Beau Serge. In that film, the character played by Jean-Claude Brialy is a guy coming back to his hometown, and he meets his old friend, played by Gerard Blaine. And Gerard Blaine has become a bit of an alcoholic and a bit of a demonic kind of figure. In this film, it's reversed. So now Gerard Blaine plays the innocent, who this time is coming from the country to the city. And Jean-Claude Brialy is the worldly wise city boy, right? So even in his films, this kind of dichotomy of good and bad is an operation. The two films mirror each other. I like the film because Paul, the sophisticated city boy, is bad, right? So he's very arrogant. He's very sexist. You know, he's always impinging himself on every girl in sight. His best friend seems to be something of a pimp. This is a very strange film. You know, it's one of these films, a bit like La Dolce Vita, made by Fellini, around about the same time, which shows a fascinating, you know, culture that has disappeared. This is a culture of upper middle class students mixing with aristocrats, mixing with pimps and gangsters, you know, and this new sort of post-war opening up, you know, of youth culture. It's fascinating in that sense. And Paul is very much, he's in the centre of this, right? And he has these wild parties, and his pimp friend comes in, and they try and pimp out these girls to their mates. And in the middle of this party, he stops all the music, and he puts on some Wagner. He dims the lights. He gets a candelabra. He puts on a Nazi helmet. And he walks through the party, speaking in German, speaking as if he's in some kind of, you know, Siegfried Wagnerian opera. And he's talking about the end of the war, which as boys, these students would have seen, right? And he's talking about the end of the war. And all the men are dead, and everyone is gone. But Mutter, the light begins again. The birds sing in the trees, and love. And it ends with him holding the candelabra up to Gerard Blaine's character, who's trying to make love to this girl. In another scene, a very controversial scene, he wakes up one of his friends, who's a Jew, by making out that he's a Gestapo. An extraordinary sequence to put in a 1959-1960 film. So what I'm saying is that Paul is a prat, right? He's a really unpleasant guy. Now, I've seen reviews of this film that say that he's a completely unsympathetic character. No. That is to misunderstand what Chabrol is up to here. What we see in Paul is we see someone who likes to use people. But then one of the girls in his group, brilliantly played by Juliette Ménial, with her wonderful eyes, perhaps best known from Les Yeux Sans Visage by Georges Franju, he sees that Gerard Blaine is falling for her, and he realises that they don't really go together. Is that genuine, or is it jealousy, or is it a bit of both? Does he really care about Gerard Blaine? I think he does. I think people just see Paul as a hostile character and missing the point of the film. The point of the film is this, that Paul, for all his horrible idiosyncrasies, is capable of joie de vivre. He has a largesse of spirit. Whereas Gerard Blaine, the good boy from the provinces, the innocent boy, is too stunted. He's not really able to live. He's only fit to die, as he will at the end. And that's what the film is about. And that means so much to me. All my life, you know, I came from the provinces to the city. I came from Nottinghamshire in the north of England. I moved to London, and I felt that move. And London is a cold, lonely, tough city to find friends and get involved in. And it's not just a move of class in this film, it's a move of sophistication. Basically, Gerard Blaine and Jean-Claude Brialy in this film are in the same class, but he's gone up in sophistication. He meets this bookseller, and this bookseller says, "You're reading Balzac at your age. How provincial." An extraordinary thing to say, so that the sophistication is the thing at stake here. And also in my life, when I was 10 years old, my parents took me out of the state school system and put me in private school. Yeah, I'm a private school kid. And that was an extraordinarily traumatic shift. I don't think anyone who hasn't been through it knows the difference. You're going into a completely different world. I didn't experience much snobbishness like you might expect, but on a couple of occasions I did. And I did know how it was to go up a class and to suddenly find yourself in a sort of sophistication which you're not used to. I think that Chabrol explores this really well, and it means a lot to me. But there's another thing that I like about the film, and that's this. The film is about how, throughout my life, I've come across people who've had very extreme views or quite unusual, eccentric personalities, out of the norm personalities, personalities that are deemed by middle class orthodox morality to be wrong or undesirable. I've found those people attractive, interesting. Like Paul, Paul is charismatic, he's devilish, he's seductive, he draws you in. But it's not just a case of his power. He's trying to show Gerard Blaine how to live. I think in my life I've learned more about how to live from those people who are willing to step out from orthodoxy, willing to step out from, inherited morality. I've learned more from them, even if I disagreed with them, even if I thought they were foolish. They've given me more in my life. That's what I think Chabrol is trying to show in this film. And of course, nowadays, in a time of excessive, oppressive social morality, a sort of a narrowing of perspective about what is good thinking, this film, I think, for me, even though it's dated in its milieu, has more resonance than ever. We're in a social moment where people are being told, this is what you should be thinking, this is what you should be saying, and it's getting narrower and narrower. But you see, for me, all my life, I've learnt from those who wouldn't stay within those boundaries, in terms of politics, in terms of society and culture, and even personality. And that's why this film resonates so much for me. It reminds me of a book that I first came across when I was a student at university. And it's Dickens's last completed novel, Our Mutual Friend. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that book. It's not one of Dickens's most popular books. To tell you the truth, I had very little interest in the main plot. But there was a subplot that runs throughout the book that I found absolutely fascinating. And it involves one of Dickens's heroines, these boring, whey-faced heroines he has who are really nice and they're very dull. And this girl, inexplicably, attracts two very different men. One is a wonderfully named guy called Bradley Headstone. Now, Bradley Headstone is a good man. He's a committed teacher of deprived children in the East End of London. Very committed, very earnest. He'd be played by Chris Eccleston in a movie, right? And the other is a flighty, arrogant, wanky, society lawyer called Eugene Wrayburn. Fancies himself a bit, likes to hear his voice at parties, that type of guy. And they clash over this girl. Headstone is the good man, but Headstone is he's so trapped and constrained and claustrophobic. He's so angry. His jealousy mounts. It becomes monstrous until they have this wonderful scene at this lock It's a great scene fighting at this lock, this canal lock. What Dickens shows is that all his righteousness becomes almost a trap, a vice. Whereas Rayburn, because he has a largesse of spirit, he's slightly arrogant, he's slightly wanky, he's slightly cocky, but he knows how to live. And ultimately, he is the one who is really capable of giving love to this girl. Headstone is not. He's so bottled in, so angry, so full of righteousness that he can't actually give love, whereas Rayburn can. That's what Chabrol's film is about. So those people who see that Paul as a totally hostile figure, I don't think are reading the film correctly. And that's why I like it so much. The other literary antecedent of this film is the Balzac novel Lost Illusions, which again is about a young man losing his innocence in Paris, this time back in the 1900s. And this book is explicitly referenced in the plot. And the bookseller that I mentioned before, he seems like he's going to be this intelligent chorus figure of age, this kind of Shakespearean figure who will tell the young man the way life is. But as we go through the film, we see that actually he's just spilling out proverbs and the usual tenets. He's an empty person. And this sort of Shakespearean feel of the characters is also backed up by the pimp character, who's a bit like Panda in Troilus and Cressida, bringing people together because he understands what really drives them underneath in a way that the Gerard Blaine, the country bumpkin character, doesn't really understand. So it's a film about understanding who you are and understanding how to live. It is a very cold film, a very cruel film. I think a lot of people watching this video may not like it. I admire it deeply. I think it's brilliantly directed. And watching it again, I thought, this is a very accessible, straightforward story. Why do people call this art cinema? Well, let's look at some evidence here. First of all, the way it starts. It starts with a sort of martial drumming music, and you get a shot of toy soldiers. And this is some of the bric-a-brac that Paul has in his flat. But then it cuts straight away to a line of people going out of the Gare at Paris, the train station. So immediately, this line of soldiers is thematically linked with these ordinary people, marching out of a train station. He goes up to a taxi cab. He says, can you take me to this street? And the guy is incredibly rude, as all taxi drivers are in big cities. And then the camera just looks up, following Gerard Blaine's gaze as he looks into nighttime Paris. Just a moment, a beat. There's no plot behind it, there's no meaning behind it. It's just him looking into the darkness. Then he gets into the taxi. That's the start of the movie. But in that moment of the sort of the metaphor, followed by the blunt rudeness and coldness, followed by this unanchored shot that just expresses a feeling, you have the difference between art cinema and mainstream cinema. It's not, as many people think, necessarily about narrative form. Sometimes it's about attitude. This film's attitude is, you will have a party sequence that goes on for nearly 20 minutes. And it's a brutal, cruel sequence. It's that desire to plunge us into a much harsher, colder, more frank, more truthful presentation of the world that is also part of European art cinema. It takes risks. It takes risks with leaving us with people we may not like. We may not want to be around, but we're forced to be around, and we're forced to understand. Art cinema also shows its different attitude in its relationship to emotional themes. So, for example, this could be a straightforward story of infidelity of two men and one woman. So when Paul eventually gets off with the Juliette Méniel character, you're expecting Gerard Blaine's character to be really upset. But he's not. The melodrama is completely deflected. And any jealousy that he's feeling is completely kept under wraps. That's a very art film approach. It's not going to give you the expected melodrama. It's going to deflect it and keep it hidden for you to interpret in his actions. Also, art film, like Paul, doesn't behave. Sometimes it revels in the taboo or what's wrong or what upsets middle class morality. Chabrol is a very interesting director in this regard. He loves the hedonistic, the sybaritic. In his next film, A Double Tour, which I probably won't be covering in this retrospective, the whole film is about people who worship essentially beauty and how that is a wonderful thing. It's not immoral or amoral, it's the moral, right? And that's a very provocative idea, in a growing liberal, post-war society, that old idea of we should worship beauty above all else. In a sense, the examination of Paul's character in this film is a similar kind of thing. It's like his love of largesse and party and hedonism may actually be a good thing. This is interesting from Chabrol because he was a lifelong leftist. But a bit like Louis Buñuel, Chabrol was one of these leftists who detested the bourgeoisie, but secretly kind of liked everything about them and was fascinated by their rituals and their lifestyles. It's kind of a curious factor about Chabrol. And this brings me to the scriptwriter. We have to talk about the scriptwriter of this film. His name is Paul Guégouf. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. Now, he is an extremely important figure in Chabrol's work. In fact, I would say that he's as important to Chabrol as Pressburger is to Michael Powell. He wrote 14 screenplays, including this one, for Chabrol. Now, Guégouf is a very interesting character. He was a big figure in Parisian intellectual circles at the time, in film. And like Paul, the character in the film, he was a provocateur. And he used to throw very hard right opinions at his fellows and try to upset them and try to provoke them. He was a very controversial figure. Some people absolutely hated him. Some people worshipped him. Chabrol was fascinated by him and knew that to get what he wanted, Chabrol said, "Whenever I want cruelty, I went to Paul." Very interesting quote. And so they work together. They're very different people with very different politics. But somehow that friction, that tension between them creates something that's very unique and brilliant. See, we're getting far and far away from Hitchcock and Lang, aren't we? We're getting to something completely unique. Another collaborator we have to talk about in this film is Stéphane Audran, who will later become Mrs. Chabrol, a fascinating, beautiful, cold beauty. You'll perhaps best know her. She was Laurence Olivier's wife in the 1980s version of Brideshead Revisited. Wonderful actress, and we'll be talking about her a lot more in the future. One last point about this film. How does it fit into the Nouvelle Vague? The great subject of the Nouvelle Vague directors was Paris. That was their location and that was their world. And Chabrol investigates it just like the others. You have this crazy sequence where the Jean-Claude Brialy character plonks Gerard Blaine in a sports car, open-top sports car, and they go around Paris, and there's lots of crazy handheld shots of the buildings and the Eiffel Tower, etc., etc. But this isn't really an exterior film. It's an interior film. And I tell you something, I love the apartment in this film. The apartment is the film. Right? It's a beautiful piece of modernist design. It's gorgeous and ridiculous at the same time. We have to talk about the apartment a little bit. So it's a long open space, a top and a bottom. And of course, the Jean-Claude Brialy character is at the top. And poor old Gerard Blaine is not just at the bottom, but he's tucked away back. He's a sort of outsider. The apartment is long and rectangular and it's modern, right? But Paul fills it with the bric-a-brac of the past, particularly these toy soldiers, but also weapons. It shows him almost as a man of war, a man at war against his society. But it also reveals his pretensions, right? He's trying to be the sort of 19th century gentleman. The apartment doesn't work. So it's got a tiny kitchenette over there. Ridiculous. Hardly worth anything. Then you have to walk through Gerard Plain's room to get to the shower. Throughout the apartment, there are these modern frosted glass doors that you can see through. So you can see through into the shower. Though you can see that Jean-Claude Priel is not actually naked. He's wearing his pants. But anyway, you can see. So poor old Gerard Blain has to listen to Juliette Ménial and Jean-Claude Brialy having a shower behind him. In frosted glass, you can see their bodies. When he's trying to revise for his exam, through the frosted glass, you can see the partygoers, right? So it's a mad architecture. It doesn't work at all. There's one way you can get into Gerard Blain's room, and then the other way you can get into the shower. You'll watch the film and you'll be thinking, how does this apartment work? It's crazy. I'd love to live in it. I'd absolutely love to live in it. But it's a sign, it's an initial sign how good Chabrol is at directing interior spaces, and how just through topography and the movement of camera, he connotes what's happening in a person's mind. So that, for example, when Gerard Blain first tries to chat up Juliette Méniel, it's done on the stairs, a transitional space in shadow, right? And that kind of use of movement and placing people in this space that's really Chabrol's, meat and drink, and he does it brilliantly. I really love this film, but I will admit it is a very cold film, a very cruel film, a film of its time. Perhaps many of you won't like it, but I don't think you'll be able to forget it after seeing it. It's well worth exploring. Thanks very much.